Hello everybody, today on the channel the continuation of my journey to find my next Aston Martin. The DB9 is sold and I've decided I really like being an Aston Martin owner and I'd like to continue being one for a little longer. But what to buy? Just recently I popped down to Nicholas Mee and showed you 3 potential next Aston Martins, and it was very clear that you all had a favourite, which just happened to be my favourite too, the stunning Vanquish S Ultimate Edition. Unfortunately, that car was a little bit out of my price range. However, this earlier 2013 Mark II Vanquish is not. This could be an expensive drive. So then, what is it we have here? Well, for those that don't know, this is the second iteration of the Vanquish, a nameplate that first appeared at the turn of the millennium, attached to James Bond's then new wheels, featured in Die Another Day, and let's be honest here, the best thing about that film, it was a revolutionary car. It dragged Aston Martin into the 21st century. However, that was a car that did very quickly age. Being joined by the DB9 and later Vantage, it was clear that its younger and cheaper stablemates were actually the better buys. So in 2006, it was replaced by the DBS, also featured prominently in a now much better James Bond film, Casino Royale. To many, it will forever be remembered for that scene in which it does some acrobatics. And I have to say, one of the real pleasures I've had in my career as somewhat motoring journalist is going to Millbrook, which is where they filmed many of the chase scenes for that film, and going over the Yomp. Oh, magic stuff, that really, really very special. That car then remained in service as the de facto Aston Range Topper until 2012, when it was retired and replaced by this. There were many who were shocked by Aston so soon resurrecting the Vanquish nameplate, but I think there were a few reasons behind it. On the one hand, Aston wanted to prove to people that this was a car equally as revolutionary as its forebear. And the other thing going on, according to my good buddy and Aston aficionado Darren, was that at the time, Aston were also trying to bury the DB name entirely, the initials that stood for one of the firm's most famous owners, David Brown, like Lamborghini, a tractor magnate that decided to get into cars. However, for whatever reasons, Aston's then owners decided they didn't want anything to do with it, and so they had a plan to create a lineup of V cars. The Vantage, the Virage and the Vanquish. The Virage you may remember as the very short-lived car that was supposed to sit between the DB9 and the DBS, but in the end wound up being replaced and effectively was the basis for the second generation of the DB9. And the reason I'm told that happened in the way that it did was that the Virage was supposed to be the replacement for the DB9, full stop. As for the Vanquish though, a lot went into this to make it a distinctly different car to the DBS which came before. Yes, it was still sat on a version of Aston Martin's VH architecture, now in its 4th generation. That is a technology developed by Lotus and first seen really on the original Vanquish, and it features a number of bonded and extruded aluminium pieces, giving the car a lightweight and high-strength chassis, onto which they then graft any number of beautiful body shells. For this reason, many people think that all of the Astons of this era have the same chassis. this is not true. They are designed to be modular, and many pieces can be swapped between them, and the fundamental philosophy behind them is the same. But they are not identical. And for this car, Aston said that 75% of it was all new. Torsional stiffness rose by 25%. The car also grew marginally in width, length and height over the outgoing car, but in order to keep the weight under control, where the old DBS had already started using a few panels of carbon fibre, this went for an all-carbon body, which is mightily impressive. And the best piece of it, I think, has to be that rear boot lid. When it came out, myself and a lot of others weren't quite in love with it. It's the one piece of the Vanquish's styling that I think is still divisive, that little hoop that they call the aero bridge. It is, however, a marvellous piece of engineering, and apparently it was built on the instruction of Dr. Ulrich Betz, Aston's then CEO, who said that he wanted it to look like it was a piece impossible to make. And it does. To me, this was also the most radical redesign the VH platform ever saw, with styling cues inspired by Aston Martin's often forgotten 177 hypercar, that I have to say is absolutely gorgeous. And if my Euro Millions numbers ever came in to the tune of more than £3.10, I think I might have to go shopping for. Up front, you would also find what at first glance appears to be a familiar power plant, the classic 5.9-litre Aston Martin naturally aspirated V12 with all aluminium construction and 48 valves. However, it was significantly reworked compared to the unit as seen in the DB9, DBS and the original V12 Vantage. You have a new block, new pistons, new hollow camshafts, and perhaps most importantly, dual variable valve timing in place of the old single. And that meant that not only did peak power rise from 510 in the old engine to 565 PS, but you also got a healthy amount more torque throughout the rev range. The peak figure rose from 420 to 457 pound-foot. That's about 620 Newton meters. However, at just 2,500 RPM, it already had near 30 pound-foot more than before, something like a 10% increase. That means that all the cars fitted with this engine do feel a little more urgent a little earlier on. In truth, for your Ferrari owner who is used to their peak power being delivered at north of 8,000, this car having it at south of 7 is still a fairly relaxed affair, but it suits the overall character of the car. Inside, you also saw a thorough reworking of the Aston interior. The dash is the element that is closest to how it was, but in truth also the part that needed the least changed. The font is different, the colours slightly more muted, but other than that, it is familiar to anybody that's been in a Vantage, DB9, DBS or Rapide. This centre section though was all new, being debuted here in the Vanquish and then later rolled out across the rest of the lineup, and it features now a single piece rather than two, which does look a lot neater, nicer, more elegant controls, nicer vents, your classic Aston Martin emotional control unit, glass buttons for all the functions rather than plastic. And I am on the fence about this because though it does certainly look a lot nicer than the old system, I've never been a big fan of haptics, and where the old one combined this nav screen with a little LCD readout, this, if you want to do anything, you really need the screen up for. And on the one hand, that's annoying because it means you need the screen up. But on the other, it doesn't matter so much because it's massively improved. At launch, this car had a system called AMI2, which later turned into AMI3 and can be retrofitted. That brought with it the likes of Android Auto, Apple CarPlay, and to be honest, it does the business. The materials in here are also fine, with naturally plenty of leather, Alcantara, and they also fitted the amazing B&O 1000 watt stereo as standard, complete with its pop-up tweeters. And I do really rather like it. They even found time to introduce new switches for the windows, and I think they must have stolen it from a car with 4 of them, because here you have 4 switches, 2 of which do the windows and the other 2 the boot release and the fuel flap, which honestly is a lot more logical than the old layout. The seats were also new, and though I do quite like them, I think more so than the comfort seats of the old car, I was disappointed that for the Vanquish they didn't offer a lightweight seat option. You could get it in 2+0, but you couldn't get it with buckets. And that I think is because with this car, whereas the DBS was intentionally more sporting, this I think was a car that instead wanted to be the ultimate GT. And to be honest, for an Aston Martin, that's always the right decision to make. Though some of the redesigned elements in here and the marginally larger proportions do make it feel like a slightly roomier place to be, it remains as cramped as ever for anybody unfortunate enough to be in the back. They even, in the name of space, sacrificed the glove box, but they replaced it with a tiny, near useless cubby hole down here. Handily though, they did increase the size of the boot quite considerably. It is some 50% more capacious than that in the older cars, which for a GT I think is important. And it's just one of the many reasons I've always been tempted by a Vanquish. Unfortunately, the stalks for the wash wipe and indicators are still a little bit old and naff. Let's see how we do for the 3-point turn hill start torture test. Auto gearbox doing a fine job, reversing camera nice and easy. I'm always worried that section that a car is going to bottom out, but this was fine. And one of the other sacrifices made for the Vanquish was the removal of the manual gearbox as an option. Here at launch you could have just the 6-speed ZF-derived Aston Martin Touchtronic 2 system. It was improved marginally over that in the DBS. In manual mode it shifts apparently some 27% quicker, and I'll put that to the test shortly. But in 2014, just 18 months or so after this car had launched, they brought out an 8-speed variant, and that changed things quite a bit. First off, the 0 to 60 time dropped from 4.1 seconds to 3.6. Secondly, the top speed rose from 183 to 201 miles an hour. And here's where things get really, really interesting, because what that did was essentially make this car fundamentally redundant, because it being an Aston, it depreciated fairly quickly. However, with all the motoring press telling you that the 8-speed was so much better than the 6, it forced prices of these down faster than they naturally would have gone. And for quite some time, these appeared to be the bargain. And they still are, but there's a bit more to it. However, before I get to that, I think it's about time that I put this car through its paces. So, enough of auto mode. If you're interested, it's perfectly fine and decent. It's a ZF Auto. Of course it is. The adaptive suspension, which is now standard in this car, and the powertrain buttons are now located at the bottom of the wheel, which I like. And for the dampers, you can have regular, sport, or, if you like, track. I'm going to leave them in normal though. The rest of the car is in sport, which is the way I like to drive my DB9, so let's see how this compares. It's been a very, very long time since I last drove a Mark II Vanquish. In fact, in that time, I have driven 3 of the original and developed a bit of a fondness for it. But this is not what I expected it to be. First off, the engine, it's magnificent. No surprise really, but here, with that extra mid-range punch, it's more effective than ever before. And though, yes, on paper, this car played a very distant second fiddle to the Ferrari F12, which landed the same year, in the real world, on these roads, this is more than enough. The gearbox, likewise, it's perfectly fine. Yes, you can detect it's an older unit, it's not got the bite of the 8-speed or a DCT, but it does exactly what I tell it to, when I tell it, and it doesn't upset the chassis. I also wish they found time for some slightly bigger paddles. These were okay, I suppose, when the DB9 came out, and even Ferrari were giving you small ones. But by the time this landed, they'd realised that if you're going to fix them to the column and not the wheel, you need to make them bigger. A minor gripe, I appreciate, but still, one worth mentioning. The biggest shock though for me is the suspension, because here, even in normal mode, its softest, it's still got an air of firmness about it. You can still feel that they wanted it to be a relatively sporting proposition. In fact, I am now going to put it into sport mode and see if it brings a little extra body control that I think the car could really do with. Going from reverse to drive is not always the easiest or the slickest, I have to say that. Right, 1 click for sport mode and a hold for track. I'm in sport. Oh, it's so nice, this thing. You can actually see a bit more bonnet than in some of the other cars. In the DB9, you've got essentially no idea where it is. Still a very, very big car, and one issue I've always had, well, theoretical anyway, with the Vanquish, is those carbon bits at the front, which are even bigger on the later S. They look expensive, and they look very, very easy to damage. Andrew, this car's very kind and understanding owner, says that, yeah, that is a concern for him too. You know, I think actually sport suspension does bring something to the party. It's rare that I say that. It hasn't really taken away any of the comfort, but the car does feel like it's got just a little bit more body control now. It is still a bit of an odd mix though. It's sometimes a little too soft, sometimes a little too firm. It feels like the dampers and springs are just a little bit out of sync with each other. It's not quite harmonious. Still though, this is me being fairly harsh. It's not an awful ride, it's not terrible. Not maybe quite as bad as I recall the DBS being, a car that I do need to revisit because, let's face it, they are gorgeous, aren't they? It's certainly making all the right noises, that's for sure, and an important thing for any Aston, at 50 miles an hour, I'm having a lot of fun. The standard fit carbon ceramic brakes, now in their 3rd generation, are also mighty. Plenty of stopping power, but also a very nicely judged pedal. In fact, at no point during this review have I really even thought to comment on the brakes. And that to me is the sign that they're good. The steering is also quite well judged, not excellent, but very good, with consistent weighting and a rack that is not hypersensitive, with better feel than the older generation of Aston GTs. At launch, many mocked the optional 177-inspired square wheel, with frequent comparisons to the Austin Allegro, but in practice, I quite like it. I might also be remembering this entirely wrongly, but I do seem to recall that the Vanquish S, when it arrived, also came with a set of slightly more comfortable dampers. They were set up to be a little more cosseting from the off, which doesn't make sense for the S, but does make sense for an Aston. Another thing that I also really appreciate about the VH platform cars, which I suppose dates them, is how narrow they are. You park something like this next to, say, the F12, and it looks like it's, well, about a foot narrower. I don't think the difference is actually quite that dramatic, but you do see it very clearly. And though that means the Ferrari is ultimately, I think, the prettier thing and has a little bit more presence, when you're out and about and in the real world, these are a lot less daunting. There is an amount of road noise in here, more maybe than you'd expect for a GT car, but I know this road is not great for it, and a Ferrari wouldn't really be any different. A Bentley would be better, but then they weigh half a ton more. Aston Martin did claim that this car was something like a kilo lighter than the equivalent automatic DBS, but my own independent website shows me that actually they were about 40 kilos heavier. This is just shy of 1.8 tons. That doesn't really bother me. It confuses me because it's a car made out of carbon fibre and aluminium. Where's the weight come from? I just don't get it. But you know what? At no point while I've been driving it has it actually bothered me. So then, I said earlier that things for this Vanquish were a little complicated compared to how they'd previously been. Why is that? Well, these were always the cheapest of all the Vanquish, and for some reason that I've never been able to fathom, they always represented excellent value for money. In fact, I think one of the real problems when it comes to suggesting an Aston to people is that they're all sort of bunched together price-wise. If you're looking at Porsches or Ferraris, there are obvious answers for each price bracket. So say for a Ferrari, if you've got 60 grand to spend, you buy yourself a 360. You've got 80 grand to spend, you buy an F430. You've got 125 grand to spend, you could get a 458 or a 599. Then if you've got 160 grand to spend, you could get a 488 or an F12. And yes, I know there's some crossover there, but you get the gist. It used to be the same with 911s, though latterly not so much. However, for Astons, for less than, let's just call it, £60,000, you could get yourself into a DB7, historically the cheapest Aston, but now they've gone up to the point where they're the same price as a cheap DB9. You could get a V8 Vantage, either an earlier 4.3 or a later 4.7. You could even, for that money, get yourself an S or a V12 Vantage. You could have a DBS. You could just about have a Virage. Oddly, they're one of the more expensive of that era of Aston. And now, for £60,000, you can also get yourself a Vanquish. These are incredible value for money. And it feels like just 5 minutes ago, you had to spend at least really 80 to 90 grand to get into one that looked any good. And if you wanted an 8-speed, they did command a significant premium for quite some time, about £20,000 or so over a 6. The S, of course, was even more money again, and then for the Ultimates, well, they've always been a lot of money, and apparently they've never depreciated. But today, on Auto Trader, the cheapest Mark II Aston Martin Vanquish was £59,900, and the cheapest 8-speed Mark II Vanquish was £63,500. And there wasn't an obvious reason for why. They had basically the same mileage. In fact, the 8-speed was slightly lower miles. Both were from dealers, neither from an Aston main dealer, but you wouldn't expect it for the cheapest of anything. And they looked like fairly decent cars. One of the other things I also really love about the Vanquish is that not only do they come with the wonderful B&O sound system, but they also came with a greater variety of colours and trims. Aston Martin, you see, did realise that they had a bit of an issue with all their customers wanting silver or grey, something that dealers had effectively been suggesting to them that they buy. And this was an issue because all their cars wound up looking the same. So for this and other models, they began to suggest to people, why don't you pick something else from the colour palette? They do a wonderful Volcano Red for these, and another called Diavolo. There's a few nice blues too, some really spectacular shades. I love the look of the Vanquish. And it's a lot of car. A heck of a lot. I don't need those back seats, and frankly I wish it had an even bigger boot and no back seats. You could have it with the 2+0, but it didn't really change anything. I'm not fond of these seats either. I wish it came with some buckety ones, but I suppose I could put them in. And some of the other later cars, particularly the S, the interior trim went a little bit overboard. It became a little bit too gaudy and, for me, un-Aston-like. However, that's a minor criticism and not true of all of them. I've seen plenty which are simply class. This is nice. This is lovely. Yes, it's fairly plain silver over black with contrast stitching, but it's fundamentally really, really nice. This has not helped my quest at all because I wanted a Vanquish anyway, and I harboured a suspicion that the 6-speed was going to be enough, and it is. However, I know that when I get home, I'm going to start trying to find ones that are in nice colours, and then by the time I've done that, I know I'm going to start looking at Vanquish S, and then I'm back up to spending 105 grand, which I simply don't want to do because I don't have it.
And here's the honest truth. I've mentioned it a few times, but is the Ferrari F12 a better car? Yes, it is. It's faster, more comfortable, has more room inside, and it's more engaging to drive. But it cost a lot more when new, and a heck of a lot more now. You would have to spend more than double the price of a Vanquish like this to get even close to an F12. And the running costs will also be much higher for the Ferrari, with the Aston being a generally more durable car and getting considerably better fuel economy. Over a few years, there's a good chance the Aston could work out at half as much to run as the Ferrari. And is it half the car? Absolutely not. If I had to replace the F12 with one of these, I really would not consider it a downgrade.
What a wonderful conundrum to have. Let's play the game, shall we? Hop onto Auto Trader, give yourself a budget of £60,000 and tell me, what Aston would you buy? Not for me, but for you. Let's imagine you pick up the phone today and say, make me a winner on one of those radio shows, and you've got yourself 60 grand and you want to buy an Aston. What are you gonna get? Let me know in the comment section down below. But for now, I want to say a big thank you as ever to Andrew for bringing his car out, and of course to you for watching. Don't forget to hit the like button, comment down below, and subscribe if you haven't already. I'll see you for the next one. Bye-bye.